Our season begins at the arrival of Bakkura. Revan's fleet dropped out of hyperspace, and the Sith Lord looked over the planet. He observed everything and realized that the actual chances of the defense force countering them were extremely unlikely, simply based off the lack of fleet or defense force outside the system. He turned to Malak and told him to maintain control over the bridge. His student nodded his head and watched Revan make his way down to the hangar bay where his troops were located. When he arrived, he told the troops that they were to prepare for a malicious resistance. Despite the fact that they were actively trying to conquer the planet and find an artifact, they were not supposed to be destroying anything. The main directive was to keep as much of the city intact as possible. Coriol and Solo looked on, standing next to each other and awaiting the Sith Lord's instructions for the landing procedure. He told them it would be a normal landing procedure, escorted by fighter cover to ensure they were able to survive any potential flag. Solo looked over at Coriol and he waved her on as they entered one of the main dropships and waited for the go-ahead command. When the order came, the gunships lifted off and sped out of the hangar bays of the fleet. Inside the bridge of the capital ship, Malak watched in silence. He waited for the ships to file out of the hangar bays before turning back around and walking to a holomap that would depict the entire battle about to take place. Inside of the dropship, Sola stood silently next to Coriol. They were holding onto the bars overhead and felt the ships rock back and forth. Gunships weren't always the most stable vessels to travel in, so this was common. He asked her if she was ready to win this, and she nodded her head with confidence. The descent to the surface was silent and they landed on the ground. The first troops exited their shuttles. Revan specifically wanted to land outside the city. He didn't want to alarm a neutral population. If they were indeed neutral, then they should have no issue going in and securing the artifact, wherever it may be. Revan stepped out. By his side were a couple of guards, and he walked up to Coriol and told him to prepare the troops for their march into the city. The Sith Marauder nodded his head and rounded the troops up and told them to march forward. The sounds of their feet were all silenced by the mud they were collectively trying to avoid slipping in. Coriol called Solo over and told her that the troops were moving in. She was looking at something in the distance, but it seemed to be nothing. Revan looked over the troops as their procession approached the gates of the city. He acknowledged how prideful it looked. The Sith Empire was a true force to be reckoned with, and the galaxy knew it. He turned to Coriol and told him that they would begin moving into the city and search for the artifact. Revan held out his hand and displayed a triangular artifact. He pointed to the third side and told him and Sola that this is what they were looking for, and it would likely be part of an older structure. Revan suggested it would likely be in the center of the city, as cities tend to start inward and expand outward. If they could find the structure, they would likely find what they were searching for. Coriol asked about the cave, and Revan suggested that the cave was most likely on Endor system. They would be going there next. Because despite the lack of civilized population here, there were a group of evil teddy bears that existed on the other planet. And despite their small stature, they would be a nightmare for their visitors. He didn't want to deal with that until they got what they wanted from Bakkura. It was all a part of the plan for Revan. He put the artifact on his belt, and then the sound of an explosion sounded off, and cries from the city let out a united front. The militia. Revan ignited his lightsaber and charged forward. Coriol and Solo were right behind him. The Marauders and Acolytes on the front lines pushed forward and began to attack the front lines. On the grounds, hundreds of troopers were strewn about. Most were killed. Those not initially killed in the blast were shot down. The mud was an ally to the militia, but it would only work for so long. While the troopers were slipping in the mud and struggling to get to the blown open gates, the Sith Acolytes and Marauders were not. Coriol and Solo followed Revan. His precision with the lightsaber was to be admired. He quickly deflected anything that came his way with flawlessness. He leapt forward into the air and over the gates into the city. Coriol and Solo were left in shock, but they followed in after their troopers and other Sith. The battle on the interior of the city was quick. The militia was no real defense, and against the Sith and troopers, they were no match. Though Revan made it clear that those who tried to fight against them were to be killed. No one else. It was a conquest, not a genocide. Coriol and Solo could see Revan in the distance. His blade was quick, and he made every move flawless as possible. He slammed his blade across members of the Bakkura militia. Solo and Coriol bunkered down behind a building, avoiding a shell from a militia tank. They had built themselves defenses in case anyone came, whether it be Sith, CIS, or Republic. They were prepared for anything that came their way. Revan ordered the troops forward as Sola and Coriol pulled around the building, moving side by side with each other. They blocked shots, but not nearly as efficiently as Revan did. They pushed forward, leaping over dead bodies and ducking under shells from heavy tanks. Sola reached her hand out and blasted lightning at a tank, which shut down its heavy cannon. At the same time, Coriol climbed up the side of the weapon and slammed his blade down across the cannon itself. He backflipped off, and Solo used all of her strength to throw the tank backwards as it exploded, killing a dozen militiamen. Revan was right behind them, running past them and using the Force to pull two tanks together and forcing them to explode through a collision. He rounded the troops up in the city square, where the silence filled the air. The battle had seemingly come to an end, relatively short at that. Revan pointed at Koriel and Sola, telling them to go round up a dozen troops and prepare to go into the structures. They nodded their heads and got to it. While they were searching for the best troops, Revan pulled the artifact from his belt and held it up. He called it brilliant, but it was just simply evolution. The structure was right in front of him, but it was built over top of, though the original design of the building was implemented in the art on the front of the building. The people of Bakkura saw it as respecting the elders, not as a means to locate an artifact they didn't know existed. Koriel and Sola walked side by side as they thanked each other for helping take down those tanks. Through hyperspace, they expanded upon their development of their relationship. The two of them were able to talk about their future thoughts, and Koriel admitted that the future seemed bright for him, still not hinting at his interest to become Malik's replacement. As for Sola, she didn't know what her future held yet, though she expressed joy, in a way, that she had found herself someone to be allies with. They both enjoyed each other's company, and they got along. Being able to fight well with each other on the battlefield was also great for the true Sith within each of them. Regardless, they gathered up their troops quickly and moved back to Revan's location. They went in. The building was massive, but the interior felt crammed. As they walked in, they could see it looked barren from life. Obviously, the modern structure was maintained, but there was no one inside. Revan turned around and told the troops to fan out. They were looking for an access point. What they were going to try and do is get below the structure. That's what he believed it would be. Koriel and Sola split up, each of them looking around, followed by two troopers as they scoured the area. Revan held the artifact in his hand, analyzing it, and looking around the main hallway of the building. He looked up at the massive open space above him, and then he looked back down. The triangular artifact reflected what was on the exterior, and then it clicked. While the ancient Bakkura built the structure here, in the last millennia, had to have been taken down and replaced by this building. In remembrance of the original structure, they left space for where the original stood. It was much thinner than the modern one. The walls were marked with the design of the original structure. Revan looked at the ceiling, which was a good 10 or so stories above him, looking back down and seeing the markings on the ground. He paced around the marking, trying to see if he could recognize it. Revan called Sola over and asked her if she recognized anything about the designs here from her time on Biss. She shook her head, though she admitted that the ancient Biss and Bakkura likely were similar to some degree. He asked how, and she pointed at the ground and then traced a circular object on the ground in the air. She said that perhaps it was a depiction of Biss, but she pointed and suggested he take notice of how it came to an end in the middle. Down here, she lifted her finger up and pointed directly to the southwest side of the hall. Revan looked at her and then moved closer to her side to get a perspective from her point of view, as he looked up and saw the corner of the room. That looked odd. He turned his head and looked at the other corners. While the other corners were all similar, it was obvious this one was slightly different. Revan and Sola moved towards the corner together, and he put his hand up against it. He realized it was a flat surface. It was a door. The people made an optical illusion to make sure no one could find the entrance into the catacombs. Revan pulled the door open, and he called up to the troops and told them to get into position. Within 30 seconds, the troops all got to the area and were ready. His lightsaber ignited, and he told them to prepare for any potential threats. If threats approached, they were to be neutralized. Revan thanked Sola for her insight and moved forward. Koriel looked at her and nodded his head, his smile being hidden under his mask. She followed the troops in, and the last ones out kept an eye out for the sixth. The lightsaber didn't really do much for their view, but it was better than nothing. Revan's foot hit the ground and he noticed it was soaking down here. He looked down both hallways and told the group to stick together. They had plenty of time to kill. There was no need to risk troops for any potential threats that lay down here. Koriel hated how cautious Revan was being, but he dare not say anything to reject what the Sith Lord was doing. The group of 27 members moved forward cautiously. The sides of the catacombs were layered with corpses buried into walls and coffins. It was so creepy, but for a Sith Lord and the two Sith that followed him, it only made their call to darkness ever more prevailing. Revan stopped at a split in the hall. He could hear water dripping from one hallway, and he told the troopers to follow him as he proceeded down that exact hallway. They kept their eyes peeled for anything in particular, but nothing came. As they did, a man from behind the group yelled out in some unknown language and fired a shot, killing the last trooper in the flank. The men turned around and opened fire, but it was already too late. Revan heard the rushing waves and told the troops to run backwards towards the other split hallway. They turned back and hauled down the hallway. One of the men split off, deciding against Revan's orders. Then, 3 more troops followed him. Sola and Koriel ran the other direction, and the rest of the troops followed them. Revan was the last up the other side, but as they ascended the other hallway, they could hear the 4 men get swept away by the flood, and their deaths were shortly followed by the sound of blaster fire. Koriel asked Revan how he knew, and he told him that he could see the slight incline. He turned to the rest of the troops and told them that listening to orders would save their lives. It'd be best to not make the same mistake as the others. 22 remained. Revan turned back and he could see that the hallway from here was singular. He told them that the Bakkura wouldn't dare risk their artifacts. Even if the people from the modern era didn't know what they were protecting, the ancient people did. Sola asked what he meant. He started forward, expressing that the traps laid here were more than a millennia old. That's why the water was dripping. Revan expressed that he wanted to make sure that the water wasn't a diversion. In reality, it was just one of the ancient traps becoming unstable, which would be why the floors down here in the catacombs were so loose. They continued forward for several more paces, and they could feel the slight incline dip lower and lower. The troops began getting nervous, but as Revan expressed, the rest of the traps from here on out would be surviving rebels or traps set by the ancients. The troops continued checking their six, but nothing came. Revan stopped and put his hand out, stopping Coriel, who was walking nearly side by side with them. Coriel looked over, and Revan pointed forward with his lightsaber. It was a pressurized trap. Revan took one of the troopers' blasters and tossed it a couple feet in front of him, and watched a number of traps deploy. They grabbed the weapon and continued along the path. As they were walking, blaster fire erupted, igniting the hallways into a frenzy of terror and flashing red lights. The troops turned back, but they dropped to the ground quickly. Sola ran forward, igniting her lightsaber, filling in for the trooper who was killed. Revan ran forward and told the troops to hurry up. These rebels would fill the catacombs quickly. Sola backpedaled, stepping over the dead bodies with another troop by her side as he laid down heavy fire over her shoulder into the rebels. They rounded the corner and Revan looked into a hollow tomb. The sound of blaster fire was distracting, so he told Coriel to search the tomb for anything relating to the triangular artifact. Revan rushed forward and darted out from the middle between the trooper and Sola. He ignited two lightsabers and told Sola to get into the room and find what they came for. She turned around quickly and moved into the room to find Coriel, searching for anything he could find. There was a coffin in the tomb, but it was locked into the ground. From above their position, fire rained down on them. The catacombs were so tightly interweaved that there were blaster holes for the rebels to protect the artifact. The room was a kill box, and the coffin couldn't be accessed easily. Sola and Coriel raised their weapons to defend themselves as their troopers dropped to the ground next to them. Those who weren't killed in the initial barrage fired back, spreading out. They could hear a couple of the militiamen getting clipped, but the resistance was proving more and more effective the longer time went on. Revan continued cutting through the rebels and militiamen on the other side. The halls were so narrow and allowed for the perfect kill box for the Sith Lord as he spun his way through his foes, before returning back to the tomb to find the chaos. Revan reached out and ripped people's legs through the holes, which made them targets. He looked to Sola and Coriel, telling them to find the artifact. Coriel looked at her and nodded his head. She quickly got down to the ground and started trying to pull the coffin up. She found a latch, which released the coffin. When she pulled it, the coffin shot up, launching one of the troopers into the ceiling. Though there was an issue, all the blaster holes locked up. Sola looked to the ground and Revan turned over, after realizing what happened. The kill box wasn't just a box to trap those in here so they could be shot. Instead, it was a perfect device to trap them and then drown them. Water started to gush out from where the tomb was. Sola looked to Revan and he urged her to hurry up. Sola got down to the side of the tomb and looked around. He and Coriel got around to the other side. It was incredibly dark in here, but the troopers had flashlights on their weapons and held them up, though it wasn't helping considering that the few of them that survived were shaking. They were petrified of drowning, but they had to put their faith into their unmerciful overlords. Revan put his hand up to the side of the tomb and found some pieces that were strewn about. On the other side, Sola did too. She started twisting the piece and the water flowed faster. She put it back and it slowed down. She called over to Revan and told him that she found pieces. He got up and ran over and noticed that they were the same. They were out of order. The water was rising up past their knees at this point and the entire tomb was about to be submerged. Revan told Coriel to come where they were, and he did. Revan grabbed the artifact from his hand and held it up. He told her they needed to make this shape on both sides. So quickly, that's what they did, moving it into piece. Everything stopped. Did they do it? The troops took a deep breath until the walls opened up and they heard screaming. The militiamen who were firing down on them were drowned and water began flowing through the blast ports and the room was filling up at twice the speed. Revan looked at her and asked her to figure it out. She didn't know what she was doing. He looked at his side and then her side. They were perfectly aligned. Revan knew it wouldn't make any difference cutting the top of the tomb off because sure he could get the artifact, but what good would that do him if he died? They'd still drown. They were stories below ground with no way out. Not even the ancient Bakkura gave safety to their own defenders. They needed to fix this water issue first. Sola and Revan looked at their issue and continued to sort through it. Coriel looked at the size, but it was filling up. They now had to dive under the water to look at it. Coriel got the artifact and got down to Sola's side and tilted the artifact upside down. He told her to reverse the image and then quickly shuffled to the other side of chest-high water to Revan's side to tell him the same thing. As they quickly dove under the water to hold their breaths, they reorganized the puzzle on the side, but nothing happened. Revan and Sola popped up and looked at each other as the troops in the room looked for a way out. Their panic wasn't helping the situation. Revan said they needed to figure a way out of this now. Sola and Coriel thought for a moment, and Sola told them they should try pressing the sides in. That was something, it might work. Both of them dropped down and held their breath. Sola pushed, but nothing happened, and then Revan pushed, and nothing happened. The air window was getting tighter and tighter as Coriel and the men looked at what was likely their last chance at breathing. Under the water, Sola tapped Revan on the shoulder, and he looked at her. She put up 3 fingers to insinuate that they go at the same time. 3, 2, 1. Sola and Revan pushed as hard as they could, but it didn't take much pressure as the pieces quickly shuffled into the sides of the coffin. The entire room lifted upwards as Revan and Sola were thrown to the bottom of the room. The water and pressure, the weight pushing them upwards, crushed their bodies. It hurt so badly until they were relieved when they were released into the city square. The troops, Coriel, Revan, and Sola all caught their breaths as they were launched upwards. Coriel went to Revan's side and helped him up, and then came over to Sola, who was on her hands and knees, coughing up water that got stuck in her throat on the way up. As they caught their breath, they heard a ticking sound and assumed it was a bomb. They quickly got to their feet, Coriel putting his hand on their Sola's arm and pulling her up as they all leapt away from the tomb. Revan was the only one who didn't move as he stood next to it and watched the latch on the side unlock and pop off. He leaned over and used his upper body to shove the topmost part of the coffin off and allowed it to crash to the ground. Revan looked in. There was a dead body in the coffin. The man was holding a staff of sorts, and Revan reached down and grabbed it, pulling it away from the cold and dead corpse that had been preserved for so long. Revan looked at the staff and held it up to the air, but as he did, he could feel the weight of the staff get lighter. How odd. He pulled the staff back down and examined it as it began to disintegrate in his very hands. He told it to stop like that would help, and then the dust slowly fell to the floor. Coriel and Sola stood up and looked over at Revan. He was silent for a moment. He just watched as wind carried the dust of the staff off into the distance. All this work, all this conquest and slaughter, just for the staff to fall into dust in his hand. He looked over it and anger filled his face. Sola stepped forward cautiously. She wanted to examine the coffin, and he asked her what she was doing. She pointed at the coffin and he looked at her like she had lost her mind. Clearly there was nothing in the coffin that could be used to find the Starforge. They had to find another means to getting there. Sola looked down into the coffin and saw a necklace around the neck of the man. Though it wasn't just a necklace, it was a ring. Sola reached down into the coffin and pried the necklace away from the old rusted body. She pulled it up by the strings and examined it. The ring was thick, but it was just another piece of the puzzle. She looked at Revan and then he looked at her and walked over and reached his hand out for it, and she gently placed it over into his hand. Coriel told her that she did well, and she smiled at him before turning back to the Sith Lord, who took the ring and placed it in the palm of his hand. He looked to the wreckage and kicked the dead body out of the way and pulled the triangular artifact from the ground and told everyone that they'd be returning to the fleet. It was time to head to Endor. Revan turned to Coriel and Sola and told them to stay here. They wouldn't be going to the fleet with the troops, they'd accompany him. Truthfully, Revan was really taking a liking to both of them. Coriel was a good commander of the troops, but Sola was extremely helpful in some of the less characteristic ways of the Sith. She had the smarts to pull off some things he needed done, which would be helpful in the long run. He did acknowledge that she wasn't exactly the traditional Sith, but to him, that didn't matter in all honesty. He told them that they did well today, and he would like to continue serving with them, though he explained that what they might find on Endor would challenge them. He turned and they followed him. Revan went into a tirade about the Ewoks and how they were cute and cuddly, but they were truthfully monsters. They were flesh from bone and they hunted like the best of them. Going to Endor would challenge them unlike Sarah and Bakkura. He urged them to be prepared for what came next. They entered the dropship and got in. The bay doors were open, and he watched as the troops mounted up and prepared to return to the fleet. When they returned to the flagship, Coriel and Sola walked out of the dropship and watched Revan as he took the artifacts towards the bridge. Coriel told her that he was very grateful to have her by his side. He enjoyed her in general. Sola smiled and expressed happiness too. She told him that her time with Malgus wasn't exactly the most productive, and she appreciated being able to be appreciated. For her, it was a new take on being a Sith, and she felt that it could only allow her passion to blossom. Speaking of such passion, since the hangar bay was empty, a long but not too long kiss was shared between the two Sith. When it broke off, they looked at each other with nearly radiant smiles, and essentially saluted to the future of the Sith. As the troops returned from Bakkura, they split off and prepared for whatever Revan was so concerned about on Endor. Sola by this point was able to enjoy her own small quarters. It wasn't much larger than a closet, but it was better than being in the barracks. Coriel and Malak both had their own quarters as well, but this was saved for the last individual in the army to have their own. Sola went to sleep and relaxed for maybe the first time since being on this journey. The trip from Ppsw was difficult, but she believed that if she trusted her journey, she'd be alright. Though in the middle of her trip from Bakkura to Endor, she woke up in a cold sweat. Her dreams were so odd. She saw herself surrounded by Jedi and what seemed to be the ashes of the army she was currently serving with. In front of her, she could see Revan on his knees being gutted by the man they called Skywalker. She never saw what he looked like, so to her, he was just a brute of a Jedi wearing all dark Jedi robes, carrying the presence of a Jedi Grand Master, with the power of a Sith Lord. It was terrifying just to think about it, but seeing it was a different story. She looked into the eyes of death as he struck down Revan. In front of her was Koriel. Skywalker turned to her as he walked forward. He flashed between Malgus and Skywalker. The moments were so quick that she could have missed it if she blinked. The terror she felt was indescribable. He raised his blade up and struck down, and that's when she woke up in a cold sweat. There was a shaking in the vessel. It sounded just like what would be typically heard when one was moving through hyperspace. It was such a bumpy ride to begin with. She laid her head back down on the bed and looked up at the ceiling. She thought of the kiss still present on her mind. She closed her eyes and pictured herself in that moment again. Then the rattling seemed more so from the interior of the vessel. Sola leaned over and stretched her arms out and looked to her left where the door was. She stood up and reached for her lightsaber. Did they arrive at Endor already? Was there a fleet battle taking place? She opened the door and walked out. The hallways were empty at the moment. How peculiar. Sola looked down and saw nothing. So she started walking. Her thoughts varied and she wondered if she was stuck inside a vision of sorts. Sola walked forward and then she could hear footsteps from behind her. One of the acolytes was running in her direction. She turned back and looked at him as he got closer. His lightsaber ignited. Sola quickly pulled her blade from her belt and ignited it to defend herself. She blocked the strike immediately, but she didn't have time or a stance to hold herself up and she was flung backwards. The running head start gave the acolyte all the advantage he needed. He stood over her in a gloating demeanor, and he lunged at her, driving his blade down, barely missing as she jumped back. The blade slammed between her legs, barely clipping her knee. She kicked forward, smacking him in the mask as she twisted around and cut against the blade, slamming into the wall. She got to her feet as fast as she could and got into a more aggressive position. His blade slammed forward and hit hers. She stumbled back, but with the element of surprise gone, she smiled with a bit of a menace behind her eyes. Her blade dragged forward and she demanded to know what a Jedi was doing aboard this ship. The acolyte scoffed at her, telling her there were no Jedi, only victors in this new era. She was surprised and slipped up. He cut across her wrist, the blade not going deep enough to remove her forearm. She threw her arm back and brought her other hand down, cutting across the acolyte's bicep and dragging her blade up across his throat. Then it hit her. There was Koriel. She charged forward and the halls erupted with a firefight. Sith troopers were trying to ease the situation, but as she ran past the hangar bay, she looked in and saw the lack of humanity. It was acolytes versus marauders. They were no more than tribalistic clans trying to get a hold of a substance that was only built within their mind to have any semblance of value. She knew it wouldn't be worth her time trying to confront it. She continued running until she saw more duels taking place in the hallways. She worried if Koriel had been killed in combat. Revan and Malak were at the end of one hallway and they looked at her and told her she would die. Sola looked down at them with confusion as two cut down 3 acolytes in synchronization. Revan told Malak to fetch her head, and to do it quickly. He turned to the troopers behind him and expressed that they needed to find the commander of the troops and bring him to the bridge alive. Revan watched Malak barrel down the hallway after her. She turned and escaped into the hangar bay, where the massive clash was taking place. The blades of the Sith moved at extreme rates, and each attempt was one to completely destroy the other. Sola quickly ducked away from the fighting as an explosion sounded off on the side of the hangar bay. She could see a couple dozen troopers and Sith get thrown from their feet into the air. She escaped into a small crevice in the hangar and looked over her shoulder. She could see Koriel, and he was standing above his troops, and he was leading them on. He looked so prideful in what he had done. He saw Sola and smiled with a radiance as he leapt down and discreetly ran over to her side. He asked her if she was okay, and she nodded her head. She asked what he was doing, and he told her that he was becoming Revan's apprentice. She didn't understand, and he continued telling her that he was just clearing a path for himself to rise to the top, and in a way to try and get her approval, asked if that was great. He said that he could eventually become a Sith Lord, and he can make her his apprentice. Sola's jaw hung open. She was in utter disbelief. She asked if he's being serious, and he smiled, telling her that he was. He thought it'd be the perfect step to ruling the galaxy together. 2 Sith that had each other to rule the galaxy as one. She looked at him differently, but not just him, the entire Sith Empire. Was all this conquering really for nothing? Just an endless cycle of who would be the top dog only for one's apprentice to take over? Koriel asked her why she was looking at him the way she was, and she told him that she didn't know who he was. This wasn't anything she wanted to be a part of. His lightsaber ignited, and he asked what that was supposed to mean, as he leaned the blade down and placed it right next to her throat. He told her that she would join him, or she'd be no better than the rest of the grunts here. Sola looked at the lightsaber that was close enough she could feel the pulling apart of her skin. She then looked into his eyes. The memories of the kiss haunted her. Sola put her hand up to his chest gently, and without even hesitating, he prepared to extinguish his blade. But he was launched from his feet and landed across the hangar bay, sliding across the ground. He looked over at Sola and she stood up, looking down to her side in shame as she ignited her lightsaber and spun it around in her hand. He gritted his teeth and got to his feet and launched himself forward, igniting his own blade once again. Sola had to meet his momentum, or she'd be hit the same way she was before. She ran forward and watched him leap into the air. Sola knew that he, with the high ground, would likely impair her if she continued to head on. Her legs dropped out from beneath her, and she slid across the slippery floors of the hangar bay. Their blades collided, ripping an echo through the already explosive halls. It caught the attention of a number of acolytes and marauders as they realized they had all been played for fools. Of course, a number of them continued fighting with each other, but there were those who turned their attention to what was happening right in front of them. Sola turned around and Coral had just landed his blade, sweeping on the ground and raising it up. His face wore an extensive scowl on it. He launched himself back at her. She wore nothing but disappointment and betrayal in her face. Sola got up and charged him. Their feet carried them across the floors until they met their blades in the middle again. Their fight was sloppy. Neither of them true masters of the blade, but it was intense. Trading blows with the other and soon realizing that all the eyes of the hangar bay were on them. Well, not all of them, but most of them. Sola knew that no matter what happened, Revan wanted her head. As for Coral, she didn't know what was going to happen to him. She pulled back and blocked the strike, and then she spun forward, lobbing her blade backwards out towards his head. He blocked it but staggered from the blow. Coral got anger and blasted his blade down, and she narrowly avoided it, ducking out of the way but exposing herself, which she took advantage of. His blade spun down and drove itself through the back of her thigh, and she cried out in agony, slipping to the ground. He grinned and walked forward, standing over her in a commanding position. The battle was won. All he had to do was finish it and ignite the flame of this rebellion again. Sola crawled forward, having lost track of where her lightsaber went. She saw it rolling away, but she couldn't get to it in time. She leaned back and swung her uninjured leg forward, pushing herself up and hitting Coral in the throat, which threw his swing off. Unfortunately for her, the blade nestled itself gently between her collarbone and the shoulder of her blade. She let out a terrible scream and watched him stagger backwards, coughing as he did. He turned over and looked at her. One of her hands was on her shoulder and the other one was on her thigh. She was dead. He would finish this immediately. As he walked forward preparing to end her life and clearing his throat, he heard the sound of Malik's voice. Coral turned over, his anger and pride changed into frustration and a bit of timidness. He looked at Malik, who crawled out of the crowd and stood before him, challenging him to a fight. This was by no means Malik trying to save Sola. He couldn't care less. This was him finishing what Coral started. As Malik assumed, Coral was trying to make a push for the role of apprentice to Revan, and while Malik saw this as a bit of disrespect to himself, he wasn't going to just let some brute or grunt take his role away from him. Malik didn't ignite his lightsaber. He stood waiting for Coral to make the first move. Sola looked over and winced in pain. The Sith would show her no mercy, no matter whose side she was on, as she began scanning the hangar bay for an escape route. The marauders and acolytes fixated their attention on the apprentice, each of them putting themselves into Coral's shoes, because even if Coral lost, they could see where Malik was weak and take advantage of his weakness. Of course, the same went for the situation in which Coral won. Coral saw his chance for victory, and he launched himself forward. Malik slid to the side, avoiding each strike the Sith made. He scoffed at him, grabbing his wrist, pulling him forward and throwing his elbow into his face. Coral dropped to the ground and Malik kicked him in the side, telling him to get up. If Coral wanted the challenge, he had one. Oh, it's not easy fighting a Sith Lord? But it was easy turning the grunts against each other. Malik kicked Coral again and listened to the sound of the bone breaking in his side. How ironic. Malik turned to the others and told them this is what delusions of grandeur got them. Malik ignited his lightsaber and thrusted it down towards Coral's face, and dragged the weapon across the top of his jaw and pulled the weapon down. The screeching of the lightsaber across the hangar bay floors mixed disgustingly with the sight of seeing Coral's face become disfigured. Malik grabbed Coral's blade and pulled it away from him as he knelt down and told him that the great deception came to an end here. Malik grabbed Coral by the throat and lugged him up. Malik was no Malgus, so it wasn't going to be easy holding a grown man with one of his hands, but he did it with all of his strength. Malik held Coral up to the ceiling and listened as a starfighter powered up and shot out of the hangar bay, throwing a number of acolytes and marauders to the side. Malik threw Coral to the side and contacted Revan, telling him that Sola was escaping. Revan told the deckhands to open fire on the starfighter, but as they did, the vessel jumped to hyperspace. Inside the hangar bay, Malik told all of them that if he would ever be deceived again by a fool, he would do this to each and every single one of them. Coral tried begging for mercy, but in the dark side, there is no mercy. Electricity rang out of Malik's fingertips, and he scorched the Sith Marauder into a char. For minutes on end, the hangar bay would echo with the sounds of Coral crying out. But it wasn't incoherent screaming. It was two words, one name, Sola Grey. And that, my friends, is our episode. Again, special thanks to Galvin Gaming, Tristan, Mandalore, Sir William, 1767, Darth Revan, Grand Eddie Bane, The Last Jedi, Apollo, Weewoo 670, Anakin Stank Runner, CT 7567, Oz of Oz, Darth Nox, The Eternal Padawan, Malik, Johnny Naguin, Sans and Skeleton, Jedi Sloth, Mr. Yeet Gamer, Lord Calig, Youngling Slayer 66, Mammoth Studios, Anakin 003, Lord Draken, Photos Legacy Star Wars, Erebus, Rex the Wolf, the main 3 first names, Darksing46, Baron Joshua, and Lord Deadwing for supporting the channel. If you want to support me in other ways, go check out the Patreon. There are updates for the Sith Clone Wars on there, early access if you want that. Also, animations. Anyways, I hope you all enjoyed. I love you all, spread the love, and always remember, my friends, may the Force be with you.